All right. So in the world of Zoom, I think we start things on time because sitting here in silence seems a little strange. So without further ado, I want to welcome everybody to our inaugural event in the NYU-LEARN Learning Analytics Conversation Series. We're very excited. As many of you know, we've had a speaker series for a while with some really wonderful speakers who've shared their thoughts and ideas on learning analytics. But we wanted to do something different. I think there's a lot going on in the world right now that suggests it's a time for important, deep conversations and dialogue. So instead of just sort of putting information out there, we really want to explore some of these big issues, some of the important but challenging things going on. And we are thrilled to have Maren Scheffel and John Whitmer here as our first distinguished speakers and guinea pigs in having a conversation. Before we dive in, I just want to give you a couple of preliminary comments. This is NYU-LEARN. We are the Learning Analytics Research Network here at NYU. And we bring together people across the university and now with this new internet-based format, people from around the world to deal with the important questions around learning analytics, using data to understand and inform learning processes, and together building the future of data-informed teaching and learning research. If you want more information, you can follow us on Twitter or visit our website to learn about the projects that we're engaged in. I also wanted to give a heads up and shout out if you enjoy our conversation today. Our next event in the conversation series will be happening in 2 weeks on March 30th, and we'll be tackling an important but also challenging question of fairness and equity in learning analytics. You can RSVP at the link below. If you registered for this event, you'll also get an email invitation later this week. I also wanted to mention that the Learning Analytics Conference is coming up very shortly. We have a couple of papers there. This is something you would need to register for, but it's a great way to find out more about learning analytics and the cutting edge scholarly work going on. We'll have a paper on a subversive stance for learning analytics, which connects to our next topic, and beyond first encounters, questions, techniques, and challenges in instructor sense making based on a study conducted here at NYU. We also wanted to let you know that we're working hard to put out something called LA 101, which is going to be sort of a brief introduction with a bunch of resources, videos, tutorials for those of you who are interested in getting up to speed on learning analytics. We're also accepting suggestions at the URL there if you have resources you've really liked and you want to share with others. Without further ado, then, I want to introduce our conversation for today. It's a conversation around scaling up learning analytics. It's one thing to build an exciting learning analytics tool and get a few people to use it. Trying to roll out learning analytics at scale brings in lots of other issues. And our two speakers today, Maren Scheffel and John Whitmer, are both two innovators who've been working in this space for a long time. So we've asked them here to each speak briefly about some of the challenges, opportunities, and factors they've seen in scaling up learning analytics. And then we're going to engage in a conversation. So the first part of that will be a short moderated conversation where I will hopefully tease out some themes and conversations across their little talks. And then there'll be a chance for the audience to ask questions. So for the first talk, Dr. Maren Scheffel is a professor of educational data science at Ruhr University in Bochum, Germany. She's been active in the field of technology-enhanced learning for many years and currently conducts research on the connections between learning analytics and learning design, as well as on learning analytics dashboards. Dr. Scheffel is also strongly involved in the Society for Learning Analytics Research, SOLAR, and will become president of the society in April 2021. So congratulations. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Maren to speak about creating higher education institutional policies to sustainably establish and improve learning analytics adoption.
Yeah, thank you, Anissa. And I will share my screen so you can also all see the presentation. And there we go. So first of all, thanks for having me at this talk here today. And yes, as Alyssa said, I will be talking about creating higher education institutional policies and why it is key to involve all stakeholders. So a few years ago, some colleagues and I, we were thinking of, okay, why is it that there's not more learning analytics being developed or applied or implemented in higher education? And we thought this is something we should really investigate. And we did this by forming a European Commission funded project that was called SHEILA. Some of you might have heard of it. And we, in that project, talked to very many different stakeholders to get some input about what they think a policy for learning analytics could be, and what is important in that, and what their point of view on this whole learning analytics issue is. And the different stakeholders we talked to were students, which is a very important stakeholder group. We also talked to academic staff. We talked to senior managers. We talked to learning analytics experts. We had some additional input from workshop attendees at several research conferences, etc. And of course, we also looked at the literature. And taking all this together, we then tried to create a policy framework that can help higher education institutions to actually set up a policy or a strategy for learning analytics that specifically works for their institution, because what works, for example, at NYU might not work at my institution or vice versa. The first thing we did is that we looked into the literature. What could we find of why people think, or what is missing? Why is learning analytics not being adopted further? And what are the challenges that people face? And what came out of that is mainly that people were missing leadership for such a strategic implementation. They were feeling that the different stakeholders were not being engaged equally. They were missing training, and they felt that they were just given stuff and they couldn't deal with it, and they had no clue really how to use it. And they also were thinking that there was a clear lack of policies for learning analytics practice. So this is what we already gathered by just looking at the literature. We then talked to several institutional leaders via a survey. We sent out a survey to 22 different countries. 46 institutions replied. They were all in Europe, and the whole project took place in Europe. But whatever we found out there, I would say could easily be transmitted to anywhere else in the world. So you would probably get fairly similar results if you would do this in the USA or in Canada, in South America, Australia, wherever in Asia. But this is now was focused on Europe. So what we found was that at the point in time, and that was about 2017, if I'm not mistaken, in the beginning of 2017, we found that from those people that we talked to on an institutional level, so those were like managers, rectors, etc., only 2 institutions actually had institution-wide learning analytics already implemented. Some had small-scale stuff going on, but the large body of higher education institutions were either still in preparation or had no plans at all at that point in time. Similarly, when we actually talked to people in person via interviews, those took roughly 1 hour, and we again talked to rectors, chancellors, managers, etc., of higher education institutions. We got a similar impression there. So some had institution-wide stuff implemented, some had partial pilots, some were in that data exploration phase, but still a lot of them were either in prep or had no plans at all. So there was clearly an issue with learning analytics not being taken up properly in institutions yet. As for the student side of things, we did ask in several universities. We sent out a student survey to those students there, and the survey had 12 items. Half of them were related to ethical and privacy expectations, and the other half were related to service expectations. So what did the students actually expect from learning analytics to happen if that would be implemented in their institution? And we asked these questions to them with 2 foci. So once we asked them, what would you ideally expect to happen? And what do you actually expect to happen in reality? And what came out of there was that the beliefs among students towards learning analytics are quite different. So there's no consistent one view. And there was a clear focus that they wanted their data to be secure and that they wanted it to be used to improve their learning. And if you look at the results here, you don't need to really see any clear details here, but what you can see on both images is here on the left side, you have what they ideally expect, and then on the right side, you have what they expect to happen in reality. And in both cases, so for ethics and privacy, but also for service, you can see that there's always a drop in the reality. So people or the students know that their expectations are higher and that they can probably expect less from the institution. And one other interesting thing to see here, especially for the service point of view, so using learning analytics as a service, this blue line here at the bottom, this was an open university, so a distance university where students are usually older and already settled in a job or they have a family, etc. And they don't expect as much or they don't think they need as much support in their study times. So this was an interesting output as a side note. We also did focus groups with students, and similarly here, there was no one clear image. There were quite some diverse views on learning analytics. Often students don't even know what data is collected about them. They don't really know what they agree to at the beginning of their studies. And again, the main thing that they expect is that it's going to be used for personalized support and to improve their learning experience. For the staff, we had a similar survey. Again, we had these two foci with what do they expect ideally and what do they predict to actually happen. And the most interesting aspect here is actually that one item that all staff ticked as, or most staff ticked as the lowest thing. So what they really do not want to happen basically is that they do not want to have an obligation to act. For them, it is very important that learning analytics is used as something supportive that they can use, but they don't want to be forced to act on anything if a learning analytics system tells them, ooh, you have to do this right now, and you have to act, and you have to help this specific student with something. So they want to use it. They want to make sure that they can have it as a support factor because it can give them really nice insights about the student's progress, etc. But they want it to be understandable and easy, and they do not want to be forced to act on it. So this, again, is the image you can see here. And I circled this low. So you can really see these are markedly the lowest, the item with the lowest results, this obligation to act in all the locations where we had the staff survey. And for the focus groups we did with staff, again, they were about around 1 hour, and we did them at several institutions and in several countries. As I said, staff really want learning analytics to be just one component. They don't want the system to be making the decisions. They still want to be the ones that make the decisions. They need it to be easy to use. They don't want to be forced to learn yet another system. They want really to have immediate understanding basically of it. And if it's not immediately and very easy to use, they definitely want training. They want more communication about it from the management of institutions. And they say, involve us in the beginning already and involve pedagogy experts. So don't just come up with some sort of data analytics, but involve the ones that are really concerned. And as a next step, as I said, we also consulted some learning analytics experts, and we did a group concept mapping study with them and asked them about certain aspects of what they think is important when it comes to learning analytics policy, and also what they think how easy to use this kind of thing would be. And as you can clearly see, privacy and transparency came up on top for both of these factors. So again, the data handling and being open, being transparent, explaining, giving insights, giving people an understanding of what really is happening is very important to the learning analytics experts as well. So what did we then do with all these results? Well, we took them all into account and mapped them into a so-called framework. And we had this framework at the start of the project already. This is what we wanted to base the policy framework on. And it consists of 6 steps. It starts at the top with mapping the political context, and then walks through these different steps, or we can also call them dimensions. And for each of these dimensions, based on the input we gathered from the different stakeholders, from the different interviews and surveys, etc., that we did, we were then able to create some action points that per these steps needed to be taken. We also picked out several challenges for every of these 6 steps and making people aware of, hey, careful, this is something that could happen. And we asked policy questions that the institutions that want to set up a strategy should ask themselves when creating their strategy. And if you go to the website that you can see here, the SHEILAproject.eu, all the results are there. The framework is available as a paper version, but we also have an online version now where an institution can just go, click through the different dimensions, add their own actions, see which of these actions are actually the ones that apply to my institution, which of the stakeholders do I need to involve at my institution, who do I need to talk to, what is actually the behavior I want to change among students or teachers or both or whatever in my institution for having learning analytics. So basically what it comes down to, and what we can see clearly, is that sometimes the management of an institution tries to plop something from the top, while the ones at the bottom, let's say, so the staff and the students that actually deal with learning analytics on a day-to-day basis, hopefully, sometimes feel left behind. So the most important thing I would say is to kind of here also in this second step, you need to identify your stakeholders when it comes to learning analytics. And specifically, you need to involve all of them in the whole process, not only at the end and push the learning analytics in front of them. And yet more especially from involving all stakeholders, you need to involve students and staff, and you need to involve them from the beginning on. You need to ask them, what do they want? What do they need for their specific purposes? How do they think learning analytics can help them, and what do they want and how do they want it? We did a conference and a meeting about this whole SHEILA project and about policies in learning analytics. And one very thing that stuck with me since then is we had a student representative there at that event, and she said, "Don't talk about us without us." And this is really something that stuck with me. That it's very easy to memorize, and it's a very clear thing, and it's something that is very important. So don't forget the students, involve them from the beginning on. And as a final kind of shameless plugs for some other research I've been doing, but that is related to that, is if you want to create learning analytics already while you actually create learning activities, there's a board game you can use for that can help you already implement and think of learning analytics and the questions you need to ask while planning your curriculum and while planning the activities you want to do with your students in a course. And that was it from my side. So thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much, Maren. A lot in that presentation, a lot to think about. I'm sure people have many, many questions, as do I, but before we dive into them, we're going to hear from John, and then hopefully we'll have a good discussion. So let me briefly introduce Dr. John Whitmer is currently a senior fellow with the Federation of American Scientists to the U.S. Department of Education's Institute for Education Sciences. There he's tasked with implementing data science into the largest federal education research agency in the United States. So I think he's got a lot of different perspectives to offer that are really complementary to what Maren shared with us, different country, but also really different kind of institution. I would be remiss if I didn't also mention that John has extensive experience in this space prior to his current position. He's led learning analytics research and development at ACT, Blackboard, as well as the California State University system. Welcome, John.
Thank you very much, Alyssa, and thank you very much, Maren. So I'm going to take quite a different approach and talk a little bit more about directly about some of the kind of research and findings and implementations that I've had through the teams that I've led at the various institutions and organizations that Alyssa mentioned. So a little bit more, less strategic and maybe a little bit more operational, if it were, as well, and show some of that experience. So Alyssa mentioned already the experience I've had, and it's a mixture of public institutions, nonprofit organizations, in the case of ACT, private companies, and now working within a nonprofit working to help implement machine learning and data science for the U.S. federal government, part of our, and helping with some of the new plans we make, especially as we transition and think about the world post-COVID. I don't want to dwell on that for too long. I think Alyssa covered that really well. And just here's a sense of what I'm doing, and I'm actually I'm gonna make my own pitch at the end as well. So Institute for Education Sciences is a U.S. institute. It's part of the Department of Education, serves both post-secondary as well as K-12 audiences. And they are very interested in implementing data science and machine learning. And that's part of the role I have there, is as an advisor. And you can see here kind of the three aspects of this fellowship: helping implement, not necessarily do foundational research, but implement some of the things that we know or believe will make a difference and can improve operations, expanding access to the data sets that are already collected and curated through IES. And that includes policy and technology. It turns out to be the more interesting aspects. And then helping develop an ongoing data science fellowship program. And so more about that in a little bit. But I wanted to really, I started to step back because I was thinking about the question for this panel and thinking about the importance of scale. And I'll say I actually created two presentations where I first went and talked about, I think that scale and context, you know, when is that not important, and that there was kind of a, you know, more context, more involvement from stakeholders is better. And then I thought about it a bit and I said that actually doesn't align with the experience that I've had. I think it's much more kind of messy and much more diverse. And so that brings me back to this kind of foundational question about, well, what do I think is distinct or unique around learning analytics, the field that I situate my work in? For me, I think is the centrality of interventions, right? And that, you know, in a sense, we're like the caregiver, the father, the figure behind this little girl. And I thought it was really cute. I have a daughter, and so I thought, you know, thinking about, you know, and to me, I like this photo because what is she? I mean, she's happy and doing well in a number of ways with a lollipop and a teddy bear. And, you know, and I like this because he's asking her, I think, you know, talking to her, and what do you want to do? If I had a lollipop in my mouth, maybe I didn't want to push, right? Maybe it's not time for a swing, or maybe it is time for a swing. But thinking about what it is that we want to do to improve the outcomes, the motivation, the lives of the students that we serve. I think that to me is the unique place where learning analytics and the work that we do, especially through SOLAR, I think is situated. It's distinct educational research, often looks for foundational understandings to better understand the processes of learning without maybe thinking so much about how those would be applied. Whereas educational data mining often looks at the algorithms that could be used to increase kind of findings, or, you know, our kind of the structure and stability of our predictions, without necessarily, again, understanding why those would be made in the first place, kind of the opposite side of educational research. And there's many other fields. I do also think that the clickstream or process data was one of the hallmarks that we kind of began with many of these studies. I think that's actually ending quite a bit now, or I'm seeing learning analytics used in ways that include a whole bunch of data around learning. So to me, thinking about why is it that we want to conduct this analysis or create these algorithms, it centers around interventions. And this has been from the very beginning of the definition, in the definition at the first LAK conference, also the Educational Learning Initiative, EDUCAUSE's ELI, also had interventions within that definition, and that's something that sticks with me. So in thinking about the importance of context, right, I think it's important to think about what are the different levels of context that we need in order to do different things or in order to serve different purposes. And I think that it's more like a pair of binoculars or maybe a telescope, in that if you have binoculars that are focused in too tightly, right, you can miss the big picture. But sometimes, right, for certain things, right, you need them to be focused in very tightly, and there's a whole range of levels. And so these are some of the different kinds of interventions and projects that I've been involved in that I think really have very different levels of context required for them. So for example, right, the early identification of students who are at risk of quitting or perhaps of failing a class. We don't quite know what the agency is there, right? Did they actively quit and stop, or did they not? Did they fail out? Some of those are difficult to tease out. And do we actually need to know why? Right, in some of the work that I've done, you creating predictive models, putting those into applications, it's been to help teachers identify who are the most important students to work with, and leaving it to teachers to figure that out, or instructors to be able to target their efforts with students. And I've had colleagues that I've worked with who have said it actually, that's a question that we leave up to the people in charge of their having responsibility for their education. A second one of those, and I'll say that's something that was tricky, and often teachers do want to know why. They would like to know because it helps them know what to do, but there's often a question there, and again, that level of context can be present or missing, and still be useful learning analytics. The second one here is helping EdTech designers, and I saw we have folks from, I think, Khan Academy and Duolingo, right, thinking about there are hypotheses that often drive good product management and the creation of new features. And sometimes we have access to groups of people that are spoken to, but they're not, sometimes they're representative, sometimes they're not, and a designer comes up with an idea for something to create. And we can help, right, through learning analytics, help identify and understand whether a hypothesis is actually true or not, or is meeting an outcome or not that it was intended to serve. Again, sometimes that can be quite targeted and focused depending on what the hypothesis is, but it could be something, you know, around increasing the use, increasing the number of levels a student goes through, or ways people use a feature. Those often people have some very detailed and sophisticated ideas, and I think it's something that we can use our analysis, our analytical techniques, the processes that we use to help them understand whether that is true or not. And again, that's abstracted from whether it meets kind of a long-term outcome to improve student learning at the end. That may be something that this is on the way to, and it could be focused on activity. Another one, improving discussion forum feedback from instructors, and I'll show a couple of research examples in a second, right? Do we need that? What are the tips that could be useful, and how generalizable would they be? And then we get to areas that are extremely context dependent, I think. Students with tips to improve their writing, right? Well, writing for what purpose, right? With what aim, right? And around what areas, that is very important. And students at what level, right? What level of education, what level of knowledge is important. And then here, I think, you know, identifying the reason an 8th grade student is struggling to learn math concepts, right? Being one of the areas that's, you know, probably the most contextual, because there are so many factors that could get in that could be related to that student struggling. And some of those could be conceptual, they could be related to math anxiety, they could be related to social and emotional learning. Those are things that really matter much more and are much more contextual. So to me, thinking about context, it means thinking about, again, that what is the motivation, what is the intervention, what are we trying to accomplish through these analytics? And going back to Maren's comments, I think, you know, making sure that you do that with, you know, without leaving your students out of that conversation, I think, or your you know, whoever your stakeholders are, who you're speaking about, is extremely important to do. And it can be a challenge, especially for people that are working outside of an educational institution. Sometimes it can be tricky to get access to those, to our students in particular, right? Because they are, you know, they're members of an educational organization, but thinking about how you can get that direct and immediate feedback is also important. So I wanted to give a couple of, I went the wrong way. Couple of examples. So here's an example of a very low context. So we did this work at Blackboard, where we looked at tool use, right? And so when I began at Blackboard, we started a learning analytics R&D practice, and began really at the most kind of abstract level, just to see, and it was, you know, to take those binoculars and look at the entire spectrum of where was there some kind of a signal that we could begin to investigate. And so we looked at, and again, across all North American institutions using Learn, de-identified data. We didn't have institutional name or anything else, or courses, but we looked at the student use of tools within those platforms. And I'll just explain quickly. We looked here at content, access to content on the left, and this is both, you know, clicks on content and then access to my grade, students looking at their grade tool. And we disaggregated that by both the within course, the quartile that students were at. So were they in the no use? And here, that's what the x-axis is. Were they in no use, the 25% quartile, 50, you get the picture, in the highest quartile. And then we separated that out by what was the grade the students got in the class at the end. Could we see a relationship between them or a pattern that existed? And the most interesting thing to me, again, looking across, you know, 18,000 courses, 1,000 institutions, is that we could see different patterns and trends across these different tools. Excuse me. So for example, here, right, with course contents, red, the lowest bar here are students that failed the course. The yellow bar is students that got basically kind of a middle grade between a D and a C. And these were students that got between an 80 and 100 in the green dots. And so here you could see that, right, if the students didn't access course content at all, right, surprise, surprise, they were more likely to fail than not. And there were much less students that passed the course that were those that never accessed the course content. But from there, right, the difference was much less, and including, we saw that students that were at the highest level of usage actually accessed the course content a little bit less than students that were a little bit less. Students were actually accessing content a little bit less and more likely to get a higher grade. And again, what does that mean? How would you use that? Very different, right? Different questions that we used in a number of different ways to think about how to operationalize content, what kind of notifications would be necessary, and why that was the case. And in grades, we saw a very different kind of pattern where the students with higher grades were associated at every quartile with higher levels of use. This is one where and this is the only tool where we saw this consistent pattern. More frequent looking at grades was related to or associated with, right, a higher grade in the course. And consistently, right, that is not a causal relationship. I used to make jokes about my teenage son that looked at his grades a lot, and I said, that's not going to make them go up, right? That doesn't work that way. And I think that what I believe we saw here, but we were able to use that and then think of grades and student access to grades as something that was an important relationship that we could dive into more. Second example is the linguistic analysis of forum posts. This got actually quite a bit of blowback from people that were associating it with automated scoring, and so that was a fun quote unquote debate in parentheses, right? And so we were able to here, right, bring in quite a bit more context. And so this is actually in the Ultra Experience of Learn, the newest version of Learn, where we looked at and showed, and the initial intent, I'll say, was to provide instructors with more feedback that they could use to do grading of students. What we discovered by looking more deeply at the data was that instructors actually, and this was part of this was in this comment in this blog post, they didn't actually want to grade student discussion forums very much. What they wanted to do is separate out, kind of do a spam filter of why students would substantive and meaningful posts from not so substantive and meaningful posts. So instead of giving an actual recommendation and a grade, what we did was we did the substantive posts from a student, and then we gave this contextual information from other linguistic variables. We give a Flesch-Kincaid analysis. We showed different kind of the content words, functional word breakdown, and used a rubric-driven critical thinking level so that the instructor could get a better sense of how that student was participating in discussion forums. And this was because we were hearing frequently that, especially in large courses, it was very difficult to moderate and give feedback on discussion forums. So again, this gives more context, but it doesn't say that much. I mean, we aren't getting to the level of being able to say what the relationship is. This a good kind of reflection of learning or other kinds of engagement to make a decision around that, but instead thinking about these tools people can use. And I think back to Maren's comment of people wanting tools they can use to help them in their work. So just three other things I wanted to mention. So outside of the outside of kind of operational and thinking about how we deploy and use research, some tips around strategy and working within organizations. I think one of the first things, especially for people that are both in a research audience, is what are the goals from leadership? What are the value people expect to get out of this? And this is even when you're in a corporate context or in an organization building solutions, right? At the end of the day, there is a financial role, but there is actually a deeper value in user experience people are hoping to get back and to provide. So what is that value? And this is something that is often debated, and people need feedback from people with a research and scientific background. And then just to own, I think that these solutions are expensive compared to conventional software development, because in the case of analytics, you can have a phenomenal idea, but the data or the relationships are not there. So they always cost more, and they certainly cost more than doing nothing. So it's very important to know what the goals are for that solution and to be involved in that conversation or discussion. Organizations are very complex. I feel my gray hair coming out to say they rarely operate as you anticipate, and not according to the rules. I'll say, you know, there are historical, culturally driven factors involved, and they rarely operate by explicit rules. Something I heard often was people having expectations about how corporate contexts operate, and they're simply not. It's not, the world is not that simple, and these organizations are highly variable. And then the last is that our technical and scientific expertise is something that people assume, right? They assume with you, with the level of knowledge and work that we have done, that you are the expert in how to do this work. It is understanding that context. And I think especially in scaling up, for me to be able to translate those needs into reasonable technical approaches, reasonably valid technical approaches. And these are things where you need to have, I need to have the internal discipline to be aware of my limits and the limits of my knowledge, and be extremely ruthlessly skeptical, as all I think good researchers are. So with that, I like this image. So we are going to be looking for, this is a pitch, looking for researchers. There are some fellowships coming up. If you've been inspired by the transition, if you're in the United States or outside of the United States, inspired by some of the transitions happening within our federal government, we have some opportunities coming up. People very interested in applying data science and machine learning. A couple of criteria here for people to think about. If you're interested, I would love to talk with people that are that do learning analytics work, educational data science, or if you have students you think would be very good. There's a number of opportunities coming up, either directly through these positions, and some of the larger foundations founded through some of the technology companies are helping to provide some advanced experts to some of the federal agencies and nonprofits and make more data and analytics available. So I'd love to talk with you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, John. I see a couple questions coming in through the chat. John, if you can unshare your screen, please.
You bet.
Excellent. Feel free to keep asking questions in the chat. We're going to start off with a bit of a moderated dialogue that basically means I get to ask the questions. And then we will take some questions from the audience. And what I'll do, if you're all right, is I'll pick a question. I'll ask whoever asked the question to actually ask it. And hopefully right now, I should have spotlighted the three of us so that hopefully you can see our conversation. So let me start off by thanking both Maren and John for some very interesting and, as I hoped, provocative comments. I want to try and tease out some of the threads with some provocative questions of my own. You both provided two very different perspectives on how to think about the challenges of doing learning analytics at scale. But the core question of why, what is it we want to change, is something you both talked about. And, yes, we want to improve learning, but I'd like to get maybe a little more specific than that. And, as John pointed out, the cost of doing this is high, both to develop the tools, but also if you think about it, for instructors and students to spend the time to understand the data and use them. So for all of us to invest in this, we need to sort of have some, I don't know if assurance, but some hope at least, that it's going to really provide value, that we can figure out what the data means and what to do about it. As Maren pointed out, people want something that's easy to act on, but also people want the agency to have the choice about whether to act on it or not. So we're asking a lot of people. And so one of the things I've wondered for a while is part of the reason things aren't scaling up, is it about a lack of compelling value proposition? In other words, learning analytics are still nice to have versus need to have? Or is it just about the amount of work we have to put in? Or put in other terms, what are some of the concrete ways that you think learning analytics in their current state really are able to make learning better in terms of having a real impact? What's the reason that we should all be doing this and putting in the time and effort?
You want a specific order of answers, or do you want me to go first, or John to go first? Or
Thank you for offering to go first, Maren.
Yeah, I spoke last, so it's your take. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think it's a bit about, sometimes people immediately think of, okay, when you have institution-wide learning analytics, they think of the really huge picture, but sometimes it might help to just start small, not in the sense of pilot study within one course, but to just start making very basic, even if it's just plain, let's say, statistics analysis of who has done what, where, who clicked where, how often did you log in, log out, like these kind of basic stats, and make them available to people and tell them and like bring them slowly towards what learning analytics is. You don't have to have this one huge dashboard that does everything at once for the whole university and for all sort of stakeholders, but bring people in and tell them, look, this is something that is there. And then once you want to start really growing, make sure you first have a goal. What do you want to achieve by actually having learning analytics? I don't think there's that one solution that would fit every institution. Some would want to have recommendations. Others would want to have something like dropout prevention, or someone to support self-regulated learning. Others just want to make people aware, and that's it. So have a goal and not just randomly implement something that you have seen somewhere someone else do. But institutions need to make up their mind of why they want to do it, and then work from there, and don't necessarily have the big perfect solution that works immediately for everyone right away, but involve people and start it slowly. It doesn't have to be the big ready thing from the get-go.
I think one of the, in my mind, one of the things that we began with was just being excited about the possibilities of the new data that we had access to, without thinking about, look, we can predict whether students we're going to drop out of a course or not. Hey, let's look at our F1 values, and wow, this is like, we can do all these predictions without saying, right, no, actually, the purpose isn't to predict if a student's going to drop out or not. What we need to do is stop students from dropping out. And what do we need in order to do that, right? So kind of backing that up a bit, I think that same point of what is it that we need to do. But at the same time, right, if you come up with a brilliant idea that people really want, right? I had people that said, let's make an auto grader. Could you have and this is a real example. I had a person say, I'd like an auto grader to help faculty grade discussion forum posts. First bad idea in itself, right? And they said, could you have the algorithm look at 3 grades and then just repeat that on, all the rest. And I said, well, actually, no, you can't do that. And not only the process isn't there. So thinking about, right, there's this intersection between what do we want to do and what data is there. One of the things that I struggle with a little bit, I guess, is to see how much of the work that we do should we actually be just supporting existing decisions and supporting existing decision making and what work it is that people want to do already, versus enabling new things that couldn't be done previously. Like, enabling student tips to come back and think about self-regulated learning that maybe was never the job of a faculty member or an instructor before, right? Like, where do we do bring in these new capabilities that may actually change the nature and responsibilities of teaching? I had a person, I gave a presentation, and he was a director of academic technology, and I was showing some of the relationships and what we were finding. And he said, this is really interesting. Whose job is it to do that on campus? And I think that's why, especially the work that you're doing, Alyssa, at NYU, is great to have that research foundation to rolling these things out. I think it's rare, but it's increasing that our educational institutions are beginning to realize this as an area where they need to have responsibilities and relationships.
Thanks to both of you for those answers. They're both very, very satisfying and also on some level unsatisfying, because I see part of it being about how much we need to work on the ground with the people there, which I really, really value. But I feel like there's a bit of a catch-22. And I think John put his finger on it a little bit when he said, do we want to support existing decision-making versus supporting new things? And I think one of the challenges, you talk to people about what they have as needs, and anyone from user-centered design knows people don't always have the best input on what they need. And so people will say, I would love this. We went through this a bit here where we would ask, instructors what kind of data they would like to see, but then you'd show them the data and it turned out that was more of a nice to have than a need to have. And you also have this challenge where people don't always know what is possible. There's a challenge in imagining all the new things we could do. And then I think you've also added another piece of the puzzle, which is, everybody's getting asked to do more and more. And, this is going to be an initial investment. Until it pays off, it's going to take more time and energy. And so I guess I'm wondering how we get people to put that in. And so what I'm going to present you with is a second catch-22 I'd just like you to respond to, which is, I've seen sort of two versions of learning analytics, and I think both of them have sort of a challenge. And so my question is, how do we navigate this tension or find something in the middle? One is data that is sort of pretty straightforward to interpret. Maybe it's low-level clickstream data with minimal processing. Not everything provided by LMSs is guilty of this, but most LMSs provide, how often have students accessed your course? Things like that. And certainly that can show us if a student has done nothing and needs some attention, but that's not always a profound insight, right? It might validate what we've been thinking. And so you have this stuff that you can make sense of and act on quickly, but seems sort of maybe to be low value. And then we have some very cool, complex analyses, topic modeling of students' discussion posts or social network diagrams or epistemic network diagrams. But the results are very complicated to interpret and often more challenging to act on. And so those are where the high value is. And so we sort of see things that are sort of too much to deal with, but the stuff that's manageable to deal with doesn't always feel like it provides the value. So I'm wondering if that's something, A, if you would agree with that as a tension, and two, how do we go about sort of resolving it or moving through it?
I don't think we can immediately say that only the difficult things or the high methodological, a lot of calculations things are the ones that have value and the others don't, because depending on your course size or what you have been doing or what you as a teacher are interested in, also those low-level things can be very informative about your course. And also for students themselves. So if we go towards the student-facing learning analytics, again, those very basic things can be very informative and can be very helpful. So I wouldn't immediately just chuck them off as, okay, they don't have any value. But indeed, there is a lot of things that are either it's fairly easy to understand and they are low level in the sense of easily calculated, or those things that are more advanced in calculation often are difficult to understand. And I think the only way to get there is to give people trainings and to really not just plop it onto them, but train them in understanding and showing them how it works, what is behind it. And that might take a while, and that might still be difficult for some people to understand. But I think training them is the only option. Make them literate in what they are given, both teachers and students. I think that's the only way to go. But and also share what doesn't work. So if you as an institution say, okay, we tried this and it doesn't work at all, share this with the world so someone else doesn't have to do the same mistake again, or mistake.
Yeah, I'd say kind of two levels at that. I think that the challenge is, I mean, it's really hard to get people to participate in trainings. So who's going to spend the time to learn epistemic network analysis, right? It might be some of the instructional designers who are here, right? That's really their response. They have high responsibility in that area. Who's going to make those kind of investments to think about that audience? Because I think it frequently is, and that group requires training, and they're going to want to, or they should understand what is some of the data pre-processing that happened in order to come up with those results. I think without that, it is very difficult. I mean, what everybody wants, I mean, what many people want, I should say, are these very detailed insights, right, that come through analysis, and LMS and other kind of platform providers would like to create them, but the world is too variable. I mean, to the importance of context, right? What kind of insights are you going to give that go across, from a second grader to a graduate seminar, and that, exists all the way in the middle? It's very difficult to do. So I do see that as a pretty big challenge, and sometimes with design, leading people through it. One of the things that we did is have recommendations, have kind of tiered levels, or allow people to go in depth to look at, here's an initial superficial recommendation, that we would all call superficial, and then from there click through to see what's actually behind that. Right. And then, what can I do? That's one of the things that we did when I was at Blackboard. And frankly, it was a bit of a struggle to get even to put, some of the basic diagrams up there that would not require too much training. So I think there is something to thinking about the audience and providing multiple levels that people can interact at. I think it, and as you get to other kinds of more targeted and focused solutions, that people will invest more time in learning about those and learning how to use those. I would say to Lawrence's question here that was very interesting in my experience. Again, when I was, we had educational institutions asking us how faculty should interpret the data and results, especially from predictive models. And I thought, part of me was terrified by that, right? That you're asking me, right? That's kind of, you should be thinking about, but there is a real difficulty, and especially in predictive modeling, right? To think about, what does it mean that this student is likely to fail this course? What does it mean that this is likely the grade that this student will get? How do we think about these predictions? I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of interesting research being done there, thinking about how to interpret, but not just for accuracy, but like, what's the semantics behind this, and what should I do about it? That is a very kind of a scary, to me, I just say it's a bit of a scary and very ethically rich area. So Paul, that's back to you for the next session.
Thank you both. Those are some good answers. And yes, I think you're right to call out my comment, Maren, and saying that things that might not be super exciting from a research perspective still can be very useful in practice. And so maybe in some ways we've got multiple different kinds of versions of scale. Some things that are possible to be semi-context free and we can act on, pretty quickly, but other ones that are in more depth. I have one final question I will save for the end, but I want to move to a couple of audience questions. And you guys mentioned a little bit about instructional designers, and I believe, Avi, you had a question related to that you'd like to ask.
Sure, thank you, Alyssa. I had this question. So what should be some of the considerations we should keep in mind on a personal level as learning designers when we work with instructor to do these data-driven course designs, what should we be aware of, and how we should be strategizing these course design through data-driven processes?
I can take, I would say, I think first to be, data informed course designs, right, was there's the way I would reframe that and think about what are the points that an instructor believes. I think, Alyssa, to your point before, people believe or they're getting validated that things are true. What is it that people believe? What are the data points that they have as a hypothesis going into the course design, and very early looking at the data that you have available from the system that you are using and figuring out how you can match those together. Because sadly, at least in my experience, the things we thought would be tracked in the data and the data you think is coming out, right, is very infrequently able to do that, right? Why does no one solve this problem? Please, could we get some analytics informed data exhaust? It would be so nice. So to think about that and to actually, and this isn't just looking at a data dictionary, but really doing an export and doing a little bit of your prototyping to see what data you can get. And then you can often adjust the way things are titled, the way things are structured in a course, so that you can make sure that you have the data being collected that will allow you to learn about the hypotheses that you want to use to make decisions about the course, is advice I'd give.
Yeah, I would agree. It's similar. I would say take a look at the data you have available and then ask yourself, what do you want to know? So, and this kind of has to go in parallel. So it shouldn't be like, first look at the data and then think, what do you want to know? Or first think, what do you want to know? And then look what data you have. It's kind of interwoven. It has to basically happen at the same time. And then think of, okay, what are the activities or what are the things I can introduce to my course as a learning activity, as a task, or as whatever, in order to generate that data that I need to answer the question that I have about my course. So it's kind of this parallel going together of things, and what technologies are available to me, maybe also besides the LMS, to generate that data, and what other data sources have I access to in order to support me there. And again, it's important that the teachers that in the end teach the course work together with the instructional designers that have the knowledge to build courses, etc., and how to set them up. Sometimes that's the same person. And then also that whether that's now one or two people, that they again talk to the tech department or the IT department to not kind of fantasize about, oh, we want this fancy thing, and then that's not possible later on. So again, people need to work together. They need to communicate to make it work.
We had a few more questions, but I want to be sensitive to the time, so I'm going to use my prerogative to ask one final question. And you may have already sensed this from some of my line of questioning, comes from a place of perhaps impatience and feeling like maybe we're not on the track to wide scale, ethical, positive, value-laden analytics use. And I wanted to explicitly sort of ask each of you, do you feel like we're making strides in the right direction, it's slow, but we're on the right track? Or do you think we really need a major course correction in how we're looking to scale up learning analytics use, mostly in higher education?
I think actually a bit of both. It's getting better. It's gotten much better. And also despite this whole pandemic that a lot of people now struggle with, but we have been using more technology, and there has been more online teaching, and people have been made more aware of actually what is possible doing online in the sense of something that creates data that then can be used to be analyzed. And people are being made more aware of the importance of theoretical grounding, of asking the questions, what do I want to, what's the goal, what's the thing I want to reach? And I think it does take time, and we have to take people into account and privacy. It's not the kind of thing of, there's so much analytics outside of education happening, and it's on a much larger scale already than we have in education. But there, people often are not aware that they're paying basically services with their data, or they don't care because nothing really depends on it, whether I click on something in some online shop and buy this in my computer and the company then knows of what I have looked at. But in education, the data is much more sensible because a lot of it depends on it. People's careers depend on whether they can finish their studies or not. A lot of them around the world pay a lot of money. So the dependency is just much, much different. But I think overall, we're going in the right direction. Yes, a lot of more things could be done that are, but compared to a few years ago, I think we're going in the right direction and things will move on. And this, it's going to get better.
I feel impatient also, but I do think we're headed in the right direction. I mean, I do, but I would, you know, I don't like to be a futurist, but can you imagine in 10 years if educational institutions weren't doing some kind of curriculum studies and looking at the different levels and the pathways that students are taking? I think that the findings in the outcomes that's going to have and the changes and impact that's going to make on student success rates, on student satisfaction rates, I think it's going to become an issue. I think it's going to really become an increasing issue. And the same thing in the people that are creating technology solutions. There are rarely robust research teams within these platforms and people doing learning analytics. And I think that, you know, increasingly that's going to be a differentiator. And I hope educational institutions, right, will begin to look and say, well, where's the evidence that you have that the way you set this up actually works and it's being used? And oh, that's something that's required as part of the purchasing process, right? That people would want to and insist on having. And then I think that's going to become this virtuous loop where people begin to look at, oh, we invested all this money in creating this new feature and check it out. No one's using it, right? Or everyone's using it, right? So to begin doing that, I think once we begin to be more targeted on the outcomes that people want to see and find meaningful and find those proof points, I think we are gonna, I sure hope, or I guess I have faith that it's just a rational response that people are gonna see results from it and then begin to make those investments. I'll say in some areas, I think especially in Australia, right, that hasn't been seen, right? I think there's some disappointment, a lot of investment, but it's a bit of a hype cycle, right? Where some of those findings, those outcomes haven't been achieved. And so I think there's some course correction going on, but I think that's a part of it. And I think part of it, right, it's beholden on us to communicate those successes and work with our stakeholders and leadership to make sure they understand, you know, what is possible, and to do that as well with the students and with the faculty and instructors and other people that would take advantage of these solutions. And that, I hope, will propel us forward.
All right. Well, with that, I think, what is the phrase, cautiously optimistic? I think we will close the conversation. Thank you both for sharing your experience, your wisdom, your opinions. As mentioned in the comments, for not shying away from some of the difficult questions that I think is important to address. I know we're over time and I will end things here, but I think this is a conversation I hope that we get to continue in other forums in the future. A big thanks again to John and Maren for joining us today, and to all of you from all around the world who took part in this conversation. We look forward to seeing you at the next one. Thanks, everyone.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Stay safe.
Thank you. Bye-bye.